What's up, guys? So today I'm going to do a video on critical race theory. This video is going to be broken into two halves, where the first half is going to be an overview of the history and the influences on critical race theory, and then the second half of this video is going to be the basic tenets of critical race theory, so you can know exactly what it is. I'm making this video because everyone loves to talk about critical race theory, but they never really talk about what it is. They always like to talk around it. Anyone from like Ted Cruz to John Oliver. So I'm making this video to make it clear what it is and what the basic beliefs of critical race theory are. So we'll go ahead and jump right into it. The critical race theory movement is a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. It questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. It does all these things because it doesn't want everyone to be treated the same and wants people to be treated differently based on race. Critical race theory began in the 1960s, 70s, as, a lot of people thought that the advances of the civil rights era had stalled and were being rolled back in a lot of ways. So new theories and strategies were needed to combat these subtler forms of racism. Now, if you want to learn more about the New Left, which is really important to the founding of critical race theory, Ryan Chapman has a fantastic video on the New Left that you should watch. It'll go over just about everything you need to know about them. So today, many in the field of education consider themselves critical race theorists who use CRT's ideas to understand issues of school discipline, hierarchy, controversies over curriculum and history, and IQ testing. Unlike some academic disciplines, critical race theory contains an activist dimension. So this means if you're a critical race theorist, you're not passive about your ideology. You're trying to use it and promote it as much as you can in the academic space. So this might be about like how you discipline a black student versus a white student, or how you explain why some history is taught and why others are not, or you're teaching it to the students on how they can use it. So as an example of this, because it is being used in a lot of academic spaces, Ibram Kendi was actually paid 25 to 30 grand to come and teach CMS school administrators about critical race theory and how they can use it in the school atmosphere to better improve whatever they see issues with, right? So Ibram Kendi, by the way, he's basically the modern figure of critical race theory. Here's an article that goes into that just a little bit deeper. So critical race theory builds on the insights of two previous movements, critical legal studies and radical feminism. Both of them are Marxist movements. Other influencers include theorists such as Antonio Gramsci, Jacques Derrida, Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Angela Harris, Charles Lawrence, Mary Matsuda, and Patricia Williams. Other influences are the Black Power and Chicano movements of the 60s and early 70s. Just about everyone on this page is a Marxist. So Antonio Gramsci is a Marxist, Derek Bell is a Marxist, Kimberly Crenshaw, Angela Harris, Charles Lawrence, Mary Matsuda, and Patricia Williams are all Marxists, and the Black Power and Chicano movements were also Marxist. The Black Power group, or the Black Panthers, were explicitly a Marxist-Leninist group. So one of the reasons I'm emphasizing that all the creators and the influences on critical race theory are Marxist is because it is so contested that critical race theory is not a Marxist theory.
So I just wrote down a few of the notes of what people are calling critical race theory. Marxism, racism, bigoted. Let's start with the Marxism. That's their favorite one. They're using that every single time. And I hate to ask dumb questions, so please don't think that I'm dumb. Is critical race theory Marxism?
Look, you know what? Here's the thing, Joy.
Here's the dodge, Joy.
Critical race theory is not so much a thing. It's a way of looking at a thing. It's a way of looking at race. It's a way of looking at why.
A Marxist way of looking at race. It absolutely is a Marxist theory. The creators are Marxist. The influences are Marxist. The ideas are Marxist, and the books say it is Marxist. It's not even up for debate at this point. I will actually go into depth a little bit more about how the ideas are Marxist in a second, but I just want to emphasize that, the book that we're getting all this information from, Critical Race Theory by Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanik, I actually found an interview with Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanik from 2009 where it talks about the first critical race conference that was ever held in 1989 in Madison, Wisconsin. So you can see here when Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanik are being interviewed, Richard Delgado talks about one of the meeting place they had for this conference. And he says down here he says, the school was a center of left academic legal thought, so we gathered at the convent for 2.5 days around a table in an austere room with stained glass windows and crucifixes here and there, an odd place for a bunch of Marxists. So Richard identifies as a Marxist, Jean identifies as a Marxist, and everyone in that room also identifies as a Marxist. And the Marxists that he's talking about are right here. Most of us who were there have gone on to become prominent critical race theorists, including Kim Crenshaw, who spoke at the Iowa conference, as well as Marie Matsuda and Charles Lawrence, who are both here in spirit. Derek Bell, who was doing critical race theory long before it had a name, was at the Madison workshop and has been something of an intellectual godfather for the movement. So all the creators and influences are Marxist, and they produce this Marxist idea called critical race theory. So just to re-emphasize the Marxist roots of critical race theory, we talked about how CRT was built on the movement of critical legal studies. And critical legal studies is influenced to a great extent by European philosophers such as Karl Marx, Max Weber, Max Horkheimer, Antonio Gramsci, and Michel Foucault. All of them are Marxist except Max Weber. You can see on Britannica that critical theory is a Marxist-inspired movement, and it came from the Frankfurt School, which the Frankfurt School was another hardcore Marxist school. Here in Derek Bell, An Introduction to Critical Race Theory, it talks about how the Conference on Critical Legal Studies was made by a collection of neo-Marxists who went on to influence critical race theory's development. Marxists, when they influence things, put a Marxist take onto it to influence it. So it's not a surprise that critical race theory is dripping with Marxist ideas. And we could go into those ideas by using a few definitions and terminology that comes from critical race theory books. So in Richard Delgado's critical race theory, he has a very oversimplified definition of Marxism, but it goes in the right direction to get us started. So it's in particular the view that capitalism exploits workers and promotes inequality. So, Karl Marx thought that wealth inequality was evidence of class oppression, and that this class oppression was being allowed to happen through capitalism. So he thought capitalism was inherently exploitative and produced inequity at the employee's expense. To sustain or produce this wealth inequality would be to perpetuate class injustice. So Marx thought we need to eliminate all wealth inequity and thus class oppression to get rid of this injustice, and that would be by abolishing capitalism. Right? So, and you can see how this translates to critical race theory, where critical race theory thinks that, racial inequity is evidence of racial oppression, and that's occurring through capitalism. So it sees capitalism as inherently racist and produces inequity at the racial minority's expense. To sustain or produce any of this racial inequality would be to perpetuate racial oppression and racial injustice. So therefore, to eliminate all this racial inequity and thus racial oppression, we must abolish capitalism, private property. And to really hit this home, here's Ibram Kendi's book saying that same thing, where capitalism is essentially racist. Racism is essentially capitalist. They were birthed together from the same unnatural causes, and they shall one day die together from unnatural causes. So, you can't be a capitalist and support critical race theory. And you can see in Ibram Kendi's glossary of terms the Marxist ideas in his definitions. So we can see here racism is a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to a racial inequity and are substantiated by racist ideas. So racism to them is all about inequity, right? And this is how Marxism and CRT intersect, right? Is that Marxism talks about inequity in the same exact way that critical race theory does, but Marxism talks about class and critical race theory talks about race. It literally switches them out into the same formula and produces the same conversation about inequity. And the thing that's interesting about this take on racism is that it actually goes on to say that, racial policies are anything that produce or sustain racial inequity between racial groups. So there's a famous example from Ibram Kendi where he talks about how whites and blacks being taxed at the same rate is actually racist. And the anti-racist thing to do is to tax them at different rates, because he wants to reduce the inequity between the groups. And he goes on to say that racists have hijacked the term racial discrimination and transformed it into something that's inherently racist. So he thinks racists have spun racial discrimination to be inherently racist, because he thinks racial discrimination is actually anti-racist. As long as it reduces racial inequity, it's okay to racially discriminate against other people. That is exactly what Ibram Kendi is saying, and that is an incredibly dangerous idea. And I just re-emphasize the logic down here for CRT. So now that we've gone over those topics, we'll start going into the first chapter. The book then goes over talking about microaggressions. These are sudden, subtle, and dispiriting transactions people of color experience on a daily basis. So think if you're white walking down the street and a white person walks by you, you say hello, but they don't even acknowledge you. You think either, oh, they don't want to be social, or maybe they didn't hear me. But now think that you're black and the same interaction occurs. You would think that they didn't talk to you because you were black, and then that's a subtle form of racism that you experience that would ruin your whole day. It then goes on to say that our culture in the U.S. is racist, and it makes a lot of people racist. Racism is the norm in the United States, the normal science, the usual way society does business. It is what people of color have to deal with on an everyday basis. It then talks about white over color ascendancy, white privilege, and how it serves important purposes, both psychic and material. So a psychic purpose would be that it makes white people feel better about themselves compared to black people, and a material purpose would be that it gives whites more economic opportunity than it does blacks. It then goes on to talk about the ordinariness of racism, that racism is the norm, and this means that racism is really difficult to cure or address. So our society currently uses the idea of colorblindness to fight racism, which is, you need to judge someone by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. And that helps us remedy, really explicit forms of racism like Jim Crow laws, but it doesn't help us fight the implicit forms of racism, which is what is rampant in the United States and what we're facing now. So interest convergence is where racism advances the interests of both white elites and working class elites. And Derek Bell goes on to talk about how civil rights accomplishments were examples of this. And he talks about how Brown versus Board, which ended school segregation, wasn't really about fighting racism. It was actually a way that we could exploit black people and create national unity so that we could fight communism. Now, they also believe that race is a social construct. This doesn't mean that race, melanin doesn't exist or different hair types and facial structures doesn't exist. It just means that race does not track psychological or physical properties. So if you're black, it doesn't mean that you're going to be a great athlete, or that if you're Asian, you're going to be inherently smart. It's just a surface level feature to a person. CRT accepts the notion of intersectionality and anti-essentialism. Anti-essentialism is a rejection of the belief that all people perceived to be in a single group think, act, and believe the same things in the same ways. No person has a single, easily stated unitary identity. And then intersectionality is basically the intersection of different identities and how that oppresses you. So if you're black, you are oppressed. If you're black and gay, you're double oppressed. If you're black, trans, and Muslim, then you're triple oppressed, basically. CRT accepts the voice of color thesis. This means that because of people of color's different histories and experiences with oppression, black, Indian, Asian, and Latino writers and thinkers may be able to communicate to their white counterparts the matters that the whites are unlikely to know. Minority status, in other words, brings with it a presumed competence to speak about race and racism. The legal storytelling movement urges black and brown writers to recount their experiences with racism in the legal system and to apply their own unique perspectives to assess law's master narratives. So this basically says that minorities are the best people to talk to about resolving race and racism since they experience it. The last tenet of critical race theory is that racism has not declined. The main source of evidence that CRT use is statistical racial disparities. So, for example, studies show that blacks and Latinos who seek loans, apartments, or jobs are much more apt than similarly qualified whites to be rejected, often for vague or spurious reasons. The prison population is largely black and brown. Chief executive officers, surgeons, and university presidents are almost all white. Poverty, however, has a black or brown face. Black families have, on average, about 1/10 of the assets of their white counterparts. They pay more for many products and services, including cars. People of color lead shorter lives, receive worse medical care, complete fewer years of school, and occupy more menial jobs than do whites. A recent United Nations report showed that African Americans in the United States would make up the 27th ranked nation in the world on a combined index of social well-being. Latinos would rank 33rd. So critical race theory's evidence for racism is that there are racial statistical disparities. And it assumes that all those racial statistical disparities are because of implicit racism, not explicit racism. Just as a quick recap, critical race theory is a Marxist theory. It's written in just about every single book on it that it's a Marxist theory, and it's used to combat implicit racism. It challenges the liberal ideas that govern society, like colorblindness. It says that race is a social construct. It says that racism is the norm of everyday life in the United States, and the culture is racist, which makes that happen. Minorities know best about racism simply in virtue of being victimized minorities. White privilege exists for psychic and material purposes, and that critical race theory uses statistical disparities as evidence of racism. It assumes that these statistical disparities are caused by racism. So that wraps up the video. I hope that this was easy. I hope this was easy for you guys to understand. I can make more of these videos in the future. This was just chapter 1 of Richard Delgado's critical race theory. And yeah, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.